As we have seen in Part 1, the history of the peppermint and spearmint industry in the United States extends back 2 centuries to western Massachusetts in the 1790s. By the 1830s and 1840s, commercial mint cultivation had spread to New York, Indiana, and Michigan. Hiram G. Hotchkiss of Lyons, New York, and A.M. Todd of Kalamazoo, Michigan, because of their pioneering contributions, were 19th century peppermint kings. If mint oils had long been used for medicinal purposes, William Wrigley Jr., at the turn of the century, in one of the nation's first mass advertising campaigns, successfully promoted his spearmint-flavored gum. Subsequently, Wrigley introduced doublemint gum. In 1912, Clarence Crane of Cleveland, Ohio, introduced his peppermint-flavored LIFESAVERS. As we will see in Part 2, the American mint industry underwent significant changes between 1920 and 2001. The discovery of verticillium wilt in southwestern Michigan in the 1920s, and the resulting reduction in crop yields in the Midwest by the 1930s and 1940s spurred the migration of mint farming to the Pacific Northwest. By the early 1950s, Oregon and Washington led the nation in the production of mint oils. But wilt soon appeared in fields in the Pacific Northwest, and by the 1960s, the American mint industry faced a crisis. Had not the A.M. Todd Company developed new wilt-resistant varieties in the first successful use of irradiation for vegetative propagation, peppermint farming in America might have largely come to an end. While the prices that American mint farmers receive for their products have fluctuated according to growing conditions, domestic production, and competition from abroad, the mint industry has benefited over the years by the growing popularity of mint-flavored gum, toothpaste, and candy. These products were widely advertised. Some of the most interesting advertising campaigns took place during the 1920s and 1930s. If the William Wrigley Jr. Company dominated the chewing gum industry by 1920, they did have competitors. One such company, as we've seen in Part 1, was the Beechnut Packing Company. Although Beechnut had been a relatively late comer to the business, it became part of what historian Robert Hendrickson has called Gumdom's Big Three. By the mid-30s, the Wrigley Company, with $19 million in annual gross sales, produced 48% of the chewing gum sold in the United States. Beechnut, whose operations were directed by President Bartlett Arkell, was next with an estimated $8.5 million of chewing gum sales. Just a half stride behind was American Chicle. In 1936, Beechnut was producing its chewing gum in 2 locations: Canajoharie, New York, which its advertisements called Flavortown, and Brooklyn, New York. At these 2 Beechnut plants, workers added sugar, corn syrup, and flavoring to chicle being heated and mixed in large 500-pound capacity machines. After cooking, the cooled rolled sheets of gum were dusted with sugar and then fed into breaking machines that could punch out 3,300 sticks of gum a minute. These sticks were then covered with foil and went through a machine producing 120 packages a minute. These packages of chewing gum were then boxed into nickel packages as 5-stick packs of gum or packets of Beachies. These products directly competed with American Chicle's Chiclets and the Wrigley packs of gum. As was the case at those companies, Beechnut's most popular flavors were peppermint and spearmint.
Beechnut made over 50 different flavors of gum or hard candies during the 100 or so years that they actually produced the variety of gums that they did. Always among the most popular were the mint gums. Both peppermint and spearmint were always at the top of their production.
By the 1920s and 30s, the energetic William Wrigley, having established his company as the leading producer of chewing gum, became more and more absorbed with the construction of his impressive new office building in Chicago, his ownership of the Chicago Cubs, and the development of Santa Catalina Island off the California coast. Philip Wrigley, William Wrigley's son, now assumed larger responsibilities in the Wrigley Company, becoming president in 1925. William Wrigley Jr. died in 1932. Philip Wrigley continued his father's policy of maintaining sufficient cash reserves and the company's traditional emphasis on advertising its products. Both candy and chewing gum were widely advertised. William Wrigley was responsible for one of the most famous promotions, a half-mile chain sign along the Trenton to Atlantic City Railway in New Jersey, featuring cutouts of spearmint, doublemint, and juicy fruit. Beechnut also advertised widely, with an emphasis on the quality of its products. The Beechnut Company also employed attractive young women to hand out samples of its chewing gum.
One of the strengths of the Beechnut Company was that it really understood 20th century communication and used quite a variety of modern advertising and public relations techniques. These young ladies, they called gum girls, would distribute free samples of gum at a variety of different circuses, 3 of which were actually traveling vans that would go from town to town. They were mechanical model circuses. People would come to see the promotion, would get the free samples of gum, and would remember the day that the Beechnut Circus had come to town. Mr. Arkell was a great fan of the circus and used it in a variety of different advertisements. He also sponsored a number of celebrity endorsements, such as Amelia Earhart, for his products, and he was one of the first companies in the country to do this.
The Lifesavers Company was no exception to these advertising techniques. Lifesavers also employed young women dressed in red, white, and blue uniforms to hand out free packets of its various flavors.
The managers throughout the country would have the authority to hire girls, young ladies, attractive ladies, I might say, who were equipped with a tube made of cardboard that resembled a pack of Lifesavers. Each sample that was being distributed by these girls contained 3 tablets. And at that time, when they were doing this, it was mainly, initially, only the mint product. Each salesman was equipped with a car that was constructed to resemble a large Lifesaver. But the vision from the driving this car in this tube was very limited and very dangerous. And in a few years, it was discontinued. On the original building, there were huge Lifesavers attached to the outside of the building. One of E.J. Noble's wonderful ideas.
In 1935, Lifesavers introduced a roll containing 5 different flavors. 2 years later, this 5-flavored roll was included, along with peppermint and spearmint, in Lifesavers' popular book of mint rolls. First introduced in 1937, this volume was marketed as the sweetest story ever sold. Whether discovered by a child under a Christmas tree or received as a gift, the sweetest story helped bring a holiday taste of mint to Americans. The popularity and sales of various Lifesavers flavors has varied over the years, but peppermint, made with peppermint oil produced by the American mint farmer, was a perennial favorite. The use of peppermint and spearmint oil in chewing gum and toothpaste was a significant market boost for the mint industry. Since mint traditionally produced higher yields on lands free of weeds, insect pests, and crop diseases, this new demand for high-quality oil helped fuel a migration westward to new lands. In Michigan in the 19th century, the initial plantings had been on what were known as bur oak openings, where nearby oak trees sheltered the tender mint plants from wind damage. Very quickly, however, Michigan and Indiana mint farmers, many of them using a new plant variety promoted by A.M. Todd, known as Black Mitchum, realized that the rich black soil of drain ponds and swamps were ideal for mint cultivation. A.M. Todd had established his mentha plantation on muck lands northwest of Kalamazoo, Michigan. Todd and his manager, Richard F. Stroud, planted willows as windbreaks to protect the mint plants. By 1917, mint farmers in southwestern Michigan were producing most of the nation's mint oil. Starting in the teens, but particularly during the 1920s, mint cultivation spread westward into south-central Michigan. The area around St. John's was destined to become the most important mint-producing region in the state. One of the most significant developments in this area occurred in the early teens when J.E. Crosby purchased land south of St. John's from Charles Sprague.
So that was quite an operation early back then. We loved it. It was a lot of fun. My grandfather arrived in Michigan in about 1911 or 1912, and originally he owned and operated a dairy farm just outside of Dayton, Ohio. And he bought some property east of here that was muck land, and he was going to raise cattle on it. And in the meantime, he discovered that there was 2 acres of peppermint on that property, and nobody had ever done anything with it. I don't know where the roots came from. And so he harvested it that year, and they loaded it into the barn. They brought it up and put it in the barn and let it sit there till all winter. In the spring, they took it up to Carson City, where there was a mint distill, peppermint distill. And they had it distilled up there, and then he come back, and it was fairly lucrative, so he started to break up the ground and get it ready for more mint. So he gradually proceeded to put in more acres and developed into probably 150 acres of mint, which was quite a lot for that time. So this building here is the second still that would be here. The first one was made out of an old locomotive and upright condensers and so forth, and just a small one tub with a small boiler and everything done by hand, of course, at that time. Somewhere in the 1920s, early 20s, why he built this still. And then soon after that, why everybody in the area was into the mint business. It was probably, I would guess in Clinton County, 25 or 30 mint stills that went up shortly after that.
Some of these mint stills were going up in large numbers in the mid-1920s because of what is known as the Great Price Rise. Peppermint oil, which had been selling in the $4 to $6 a pound range, suddenly shot up to $25, $28, and even $30 or more a pound.
Well, in the spring of 1925, late frosts decimated agricultural fields in Michigan and Indiana, including the mint fields. The frost itself had been preceded by bad winters and bad falls. The frost was then followed by an extremely desiccating summer. As a result, mint supplies were considerably reduced. When the harvesting began, they weren't getting as much oil as everybody expected. And so prices started to rise. And since there was no oil available, basically, until the distilling season of 1926, prices continued to go up.
During the 20s and 30s, you saw mint oil get up to some historical levels at that time of $20 and $30 a pound, which makes a barrel of peppermint oil worth maybe as much as $10,000. In 1920, that was worth a lot more than it is today.
It was also an interesting time period in the sense that peppermint oil became so valuable that it had to be specially guarded. And so I presume that the country dealers like Todd and Lehman and Brown and so forth might have had vaults built in their buildings to protect that oil. And I know that in Bremen, Indiana, and I know it also happened in Michigan and other places, but I don't know the name of the banks, it was Bremen State Bank, actually stored peppermint in their vaults during that tremendous price rise period.
I guess in the 20s or 30s, mint oil was probably worth more than gold. And the bank, the story goes, the bank used to make my grandpa bring his oil out of the basement and bring it to the vault across the street in Bremen, Indiana. And so instead of doing that every day, my grandfather just had a vault of his own put in. We have another building in South Bend, Indiana, too, that has a vault in it as well. And we used to keep it locked up at night. We really don't anymore. Banks don't require that. But it's kind of interesting to see in some of these older buildings that how much value the banks put on a commodity like peppermint oil.
More than one peppermint and spearmint oil farmer during that time period paid the mortgage on their farms as a result of their harvesting and production process that year. Profits went way up, $30 a pound, you know, for peppermint oil. And if you were getting 30 to 40 pounds an acre, you can imagine if you had 60 acres in peppermint, what the profits on that might be. But like practically all agricultural products, once that took place, every farmer in the United States thought they might try to get into the mint market. And by 1929, mint had been introduced into about 25 different states. And of course, the supply increased, demand dropped, prices moderated. Most of those people that got into it because of the great price rise failed in their pursuits. By 1930, you were back in Michigan, Indiana, Oregon, and Washington, and a little bit in Idaho.
Perhaps one of the most dramatic stories in the great price rise is that of Ward Vail of St. John's, Michigan. Ward, having succeeded as a young farmer in growing row crops, talked his father into planting some mint on the home farm.
This distill is my grandfather's, Arthur A. Vail. He and my father, Ward Vail, built it in the early 20s. My memory of what my grandfather raised isn't good, but my father, I remember, our farm was what they called a hard ground farm. My mother and father bought this farm when they were married and built the house and barns. Probably the first 4 or 5 years they raised primarily beans here. This is what I referred to as a hard ground farm, and for about 4 years he raised primarily beans, and that was very successful. There was a few people raising peppermint, and it seemed to be a very lucrative business, so he naturally wanted to get into it. First off, for his father, my grandfather's farm was not a productive farm. It wasn't really a hard ground farm where you could raise a good amount of beans or wheat or corn. There was so much muck land on it. Well, I think he was doing it for his mother and father. They hadn't prospered like he'd hoped they could, and they'd helped him purchase a farm, and they'd helped him build his house and his barns, and he was doing real well, and he wanted them to succeed in the same manner.
So he was interested in getting his dad had a little bit of muck on his farm, to get him into the mint business. But his dad was hard to talk into it. He was against it. But his brother was for it. So the two of them were able to convince the father that he could try it at least, and they bought these roots from Mrs. Fowler, and the first year they had this barrel mint. And from there on, their main crop was peppermint.
That first year, my grandfather and father had 1 barrel of peppermint oil, which is 400 pounds. And my mother and father took it to Kalamazoo to be sold. And when they came back, my grandmother had taken care of me and my sisters, and it was like a celebration. The check was so large that they couldn't believe it.
And The first check, as I remember, was in the neighborhood of $12,000. It was 400 pounds in the barrel, and which would make it in the neighborhood of $30 a pound, which is a lot of money in those days.
And I think after he realized how much money was to be made in the peppermint, then he was interested in it for himself as well.
My grandfather's name was Eugene Andrew Livingston, and he acquired this property in 1902 and started farming it in earnest in 1905. And he first raised vegetables on the muck ground, and then in 1927 he got some mint roots. And my father, Eugene Alden Livingston, joined him in 1928 when he finished a short course at Michigan State, and they built this still in 1929, which was an open air still at that time, and about 2 or 3 years later they put the building over the still. I believe this still is probably about the second oldest still in the St. John's area. I believe the Crosby still predates this still, but as far as stills that are still running, I believe this would be about the second oldest still in St. John's area. The reason that the mint industry is not as productive in the St. John's area anymore can be laid to several different things. As muck ground ages, a disease called verticillium wilt comes into the land, and it becomes more expensive to keep the crop growing on that soil that has been infected with the wilt. And also, when that happens, a lot of people just pull up stakes and move to virgin muck and start over again. So we keep losing people through that. And then also, in some areas, they have been able to produce larger crops than we have in this area.
Ironically, just about the time of the great price rise of the mid-1920s, mint farmers in southwestern Michigan found themselves facing declining oil yields due to verticillium wilt. Mint had initially been promoted as a relatively pest and disease-free crop. Walter Van Fleet, in a farmer's bulletin published by the USDA in 1915, wrote that peppermint has few serious diseases and spearmint has practically none. By the mid-1920s, however, mint growers in southwestern Michigan were having problems with verticillium wilt. Although wilt did not affect the quality of mint oil, infected plants had stunted and bronze leaves. Fields heavily infested with wilt in southwestern Michigan, where wilt had first been discovered, produced less of a yield in oil. Farmers with infected fields in the historic mint-growing regions of southwestern Michigan either switched to other crops or searched out new and uninfected, at least for a time, lands suitable for mint cultivation in south-central Michigan, northern Indiana, Wisconsin, and the Pacific Northwest. Even more so than the great price rise of the mid-1920s, the devastating effects of verticillium wilt over a period of decades forced a migration of mint cultivation westward.
At the same time that the market was increasing, yields were declining in the traditional Midwestern fields because of a whole host of factors. They had been used too long, there was new diseases beginning to appear that were destructive.
Verticillium wilt is a systemic. It is taken through the feeder roots into the plant and up into the stem, and it is a disease that will just simply kill the plant, especially the peppermint. And peppermint is a migratory crop. It started in New York State and has progressed across the United States.
The discovery of verticillium wilt in southwestern Michigan, which resulted in lower yield of oil from infected fields, led to the migration of mint cultivation to new lands elsewhere in Michigan.
From Michigan, it spread into Indiana. Typical producing areas later, the successful producing areas in Michigan and Indiana were the famous mucklands, although that's not where the product appeared first in Michigan.
Most of the growers in Wisconsin actually came from Michigan. They basically, people that were in Michigan that had problems with wilt went over to Wisconsin, started growing peppermint and muckland soils over there.
And the problem with mint really has been verticillium wilt that's made it a migratory crop that's forced us to find new areas to grow it, ultimately out to the Pacific Northwest, which was really started in the 20s, but not until after World War II did it really become a significant player in the production of mint.
There was a lot of research on mint as plants. It was discovered that photo period was very important, you know, in the maximum production, and that southern Michigan and northern Indiana were not in a good photo period belt of the United States. So Oliver Todd of the Todd family went to northern Idaho, figuring that was a pretty good photo period. And that enterprise proved in essence to be successful.
I believe it was around 1913 Oliver Todd immigrated or migrated out here to Oregon into the Willamette Valley in Eugene. And that following season he established some peppermint in a garden, and then he took it up to some farmers in the Albany area, and there's a few growers that planted some small acreage, and from there it seemed like it was doing fairly well.
WJ turnage, from what I hear from my uncle and my father, and I can't remember, I was too small with Uncle Willie, but he joined with Oliver Todd, who brought some mint out, and he was a brother, I think, of A.M. Todd, and brought it out from the Michigan area to Idaho first, and then down around the Eugene area. WJ took it up to his little town over there called Crabtree at the same time, more or less. I think Todd's probably built the still, and Willie kind of played along the edges and took some roots that were shipped out and planted them, I think, around the Crabtree area.
They had good quality oil coming out of the valley.
We are in the Talbot area of the Willamette Valley. This vast area of river bottom soil is high productive, as you can tell by looking at the corn, the peppermint in the background, and again corn further back. This area is noted for many years, one of the oldest producing areas of the Willamette Valley. These items here are the original cooker tanks that we used to cook the peppermint in many years ago.
The Midwestern mint plants, when they were transferred into a higher photo period in Oregon, Washington, produced much more results in terms of pounds per acre than the traditional Michigan fields.
They brought the oil or the plants back into Eugene area, down into the Coburg area, and Springfield, which is to the north and to the east of Eugene.
In 1914, just a few years after Oliver Todd arrived in the Willamette Valley, Clyde Sidwell planted the first mint in the Coburg area. Sidwell was also instrumental in encouraging other farmers to plant mint. Leon Funk was one such local grower. Leon had moved with his parents to the Coburg area in 1921 after his father had purchased a 16-acre farm. Shortly afterwards, Leon married Flossie Morris. Her family had extensive land holdings in the Willamette Valley. With that financial backing, Leon purchased his first farm in the early 1920s. He grew potatoes, peas, and other crops. By the early 1930s, Sidwell apparently persuaded Leon Funk to try his hand at peppermint. Leon himself now joined a small group of pioneering mint farmers in the Willamette Valley. For close to 7 decades, the Funk family has been prominent in the growing of mint and other essential oils. Leon's son Morris and grandson Richard have carried on the family tradition.
What we're doing here is we brought the tubs in full of chopped, what we call hay, but most people would call it mint hay. And we bring it in here in these closed containers. We pass high pressure steam through these lines into a manifold, and the floors of these vats are perforated and allow the steam to percolate up through the material, vaporizing the oil into oil vapor, and out the top exits the water vapor and oil vapor, and of course goes on into the distillery into the cooling coils. Well, we're in the early phases of our distillation process for this year, and before you see the operation at work. Right here we have the cooling coils. This is where the steam and oil vapor is condensed to water and oil. Of course, out here is the water and oil mix. Goes into receiving or separating cans. This can allows the oil to float on top of the water, allowing us to collect the oil off the top into our barrels, and of course any excess water to exit into a drain.
I'm the second generation, and my son Richard is the third generation. And he's doing a very good job. Probably doing better than what the old man is. Or was, put it that way. My father was one of the first farmers who started growing peppermint. And I recall when I was just a little shaver, when he started growing mint, and they had to do it the hard way, of course. Cut it off with a hoe and rake it and shock it and haul it in. I'm the second generation, and my son Richard is the third generation. And he's doing a very good job. Probably doing better than what the old man is. Or was, put it that way.
Lived farming to the day he died, so that was the love of his life.
And the Jefferson area prospered around Albany, Salem, Junction City area over the next 50 years, and it became very apparent that the Willamette Valley was producing one of the highest quality oils in the United States. It's been a good crop in the Willamette Valley, and it has spread into the Madras area in the 1950s with the development of an irrigation system.
Historically, mint has had or demanded a lot of water for growth, and in this area in the Midwest we used generally muck soils, which were very wet soils. Then when the irrigation opened up in the Pacific Northwest, there were mint plants taken out there, grown very effectively.
The first commercial production of peppermint that I know of was grown in the Redmond area of Central Oregon in 1927 or 28. But it was short-lived. Production didn't continue at that time. In 1955-56, peppermint again was tried in the Madras area. The production from the Madras area was high quality. It's a very good blending oil. It is used to blend with oils from other areas. In the 60s and into the 70s, the Madras area, Jefferson County, produced more peppermint oil than any county in the United States.
Mint grows so well in the Pacific Northwest because the growing conditions are ideal. These would include deep, fertile, well-drained soils with plenty of good, clean irrigation water. And very important would be its long day lengths in the summertime with ideal temperatures, which triggers mint oil production.
Starting at the north in the Columbia Basin, down through the Yakima Valley, into central Oregon, on over into eastern Oregon, into Idaho. Of course, the Willamette Valley is one of the older producing areas and still is producing a lot of peppermint oil.
Historically, I think this has been a unique industry because in dating back into the late 40s and early 50s, the research has been supported in a cooperative way.
Mint was first started in the United States on the East Coast in New York, and it came out to Ohio and came into the Midwest. The disease verticillium wilt is following with the mint. It's a natural organism that affects the growth of mint. And it stays in the soil for a long time, and it's here in the Oregon, it's in all the growing areas.
This particular wilt we're talking about was specific to mint crops. It infects the root system and interrupts the flow of the sap, so-called, within the plant, and eventually starves it.
It's a perennial problem of peppermint. It seems like everywhere peppermint is growing, wilt soon shows up. And this limits the age of your planting or your stand of peppermint. And it's a disease that shuts off the vessels that carry the moisture up the stem. And this really limits how well your peppermint is doing.
And right here I have a display of the cancer that we call in mint verticillium wilt. It affects, the wilt is in the soil, gets into the roots and plugs the xylem and the phloem systems up to where the nutrients and the moisture can't get up through the stems, and then we have twisting and bronzing of the plant, and it slowly kills the plant, and then it will leave spores in the soil to affect the next plant next to it. Animals will get in the field and move it around. Some of our pipe movers will move it around. Neighboring fields that have had mint, the dust will spread onto other fields and will become infected.
It's resident in the soil. It's tough to it was tough to control by conventional means. So recognizing its threat to the industry, several of the end users of mint, specifically the Wrigley Company at that time, the William Wrigley Jr. Company, and the Beechnut Company at that time, which later became a part of Beechnut LIFESAVERS and then kind of disappeared into Nabisco, I think. But in any case, they made contributions to Purdue University, to Dr. Green at Purdue University, and to Dr. Ray Nelson at Michigan State University to work on this program. Our company also participated in financing those two projects. Subsequently, we interested other substantial end users in contributing to that fund, and we would go around, Dr. Ralph Green at Purdue and I would one year make a tour of those I believe it was 5 companies who were participating in addition to our own, and make a presentation of the work that had been done that year. And then the next year I would go around with, at that time it was Dr. then Horner, Jack Horner of Oregon State University, and we'd make the circuit. And eventually it became obvious that what was needed was something more formalized. And so the Mint Industry Research Council was born. And we invited larger participation at that point from other dealers such as ourselves and from growers and grower organizations as well, mint grower organizations. And we succeeded in doing that, although the corporate contributions were continued to provide the bulk of the financing. And That started in 1955, I believe, and is still going strong with a very significant budget involving crop improvement and disease control. And it's a very important segment of the mint industry now. So we really feel we accomplished something significant in getting that going.
Been able to learn a little bit more how to handle this disease, and we've learned to plant clean roots on clean soil and use short rotations, and now we have some rootstock certification programs that guarantee us of a clean supply of roots.
But over time we've learned how to manage wilt with crop rotation. The A.M. Todd Company initiated a breeding program in the 40s and into the 50s, which was assumed by the Mint Industry Research Council.
Our company recognized that its future depended pretty much on the success of the mint industry, and the mint industry was in some peril from this disease, which maybe would involve more of an effort from us. And so we decided to go on the plant improvement disease-resistant varietal approach by creating new varieties. And for this purpose, we hired a Dr. Merritt Murray from the University of Georgia. He was a graduate of Cornell University in plant breeding and genetics. And we set up a greenhouse for him here, and he worked for 25 years.
Murray's chief concern at that time, as I remember talking with him, and of course this may not have been his chief concern, this is just the way I remember it, was, as it was of most people in Michigan, the development of genetic varieties that would be disease resistant, because there were certain diseases beginning to appear in the Michigan and Indiana populations of commercial mints.
What Todd got involved in was the development of wilt-resistant plants, and it was the first successful use of irradiation for vegetative propagation. That's a mouthful, but it essentially means it was the first actual successful commercial success of using irradiation to convert plants. And that was under Bill Murray, who was our plant breeder for about 20-some years.
The route he ultimately chose was to create new varieties by bombarding the growing tissues with neutrons, which was a development that was coming along in agriculture, of course, following the atomic energy interest of the government. So we used the government's laboratory at Brookhaven, New York.
What you're looking for in that process, and you're looking for those individual plants which simply by chance had suffered minimal amount of genetic damage so far as their plant characteristics were concerned. And hopefully then, but in that genetic change that took place through the induced mutation, there would be individuals there that would show increased levels of resistance to this particular disease. So it is literally the needle in the haystack. And frankly, I think, and Murray would be the first one to tell you this, was that I think he and the rest of us worked with were extremely lucky.
But Murray also was a very gifted geneticist in the sense that he was interested in flavor, aroma, things of that type that speak to the quality of the product. And therefore his genetic experiments, dealt across the board. And his test plots, were diverse and enormous.
And I remember Dr. Murray sorting through these plants year after year, reducing them, reducing them, reducing them. At the same time, we finally set out plots of the surviving 10 or 15 candidates, and it was quite exciting to see them in the field, replicated plots, dead ones here and there, but here, here, and here, bright green ones, standing up there with their flags flying, so we knew we were onto something at that point. And at that time, we then had to enroll the large end users of mint to approve the qualities of these plants that were the final candidates. Ultimately, we came to two, which were accepted and put into commercial use. One was called Todd's Mitchum, which is the principal plant being grown in a number of districts in Oregon and Washington at this time. And the other was the Murray Mitchum.
He would never have named that Murray Mitchum. Obviously, he was not a person who would have named it himself. So it was only after considerable insistence that he had to be recognized in this process, and so this was named in his honor and after his retirement. Subsequently, then, this man Don Roberts, a geneticist, continued the program, continued the irradiation approach to the program, and subsequently a third variety, and again, this was named in Roberts' recognition of Roberts' effort, and it's called Roberts Mitchum. So those three, Todd Mitchum, Murray Mitchum, Roberts Mitchum, are the three varieties that have originated from that irradiation mutation program.
Recognize that the Todd Company had a very vested interest in preservation here. I mean, it's our lifeline. So while we can take some pride in what we have accomplished as a company and funding of research, and it just had to be done.
We have a couple of verticillium wilt resistant strains that we're growing now to help manage our wilt problems. And this is what this field is. It's Murray Mitchum. And we can't leave it in forever, but we have a longer rotation than what we would with black Mitchum. In the future, we're hoping to continue with our breeding program and to develop another strain that will be able to completely be resistant to verticillium wilt.
Not anybody can just grow peppermint.
Well, you have to have a feel for it, and I think it's not getting any less complicated. There's a lot of research money being spent on new varieties and new ways to combat disease and insects, and we're losing some of our tools in the chemical area, and so we have to be real careful and try to have something in its place that might be more acceptable.
The MIRC stands for Mint Industry Research Council. It is an organization which represents the United States mint oil industry, and it's comprised of a cross-section of the entire industry, from growers to manufacturers of mint-flavored products.
One of the things that the MIRC and the mint world is very conscious of is finding alternatives and environmentally friendly chemicals that can be used for mint that are safe and labeled for use. So we are constantly funding research to review new chemicals that come along. The dosage levels are constantly being reduced to try to find more safer, tolerant levels of use. And so what we've learned and tried to adapt to mint and is being used quite effectively is to use insects that are actually beneficial, and to actually spread them out, raise them up, and then spread them out in the mint field. And these beneficial pests will actually feed on the pests that are doing damage to the mint and reduce the levels of insect damage to near negligible, and it's able to obviously be much more environmentally friendly.
The Mint Industry Research Council has actually been leaders and pioneers in the area of research of alternative pest control methods. The Mint Industry Research Council began funding this research over 25 years ago, and it resulted in several master's and PhD degrees. We pride ourselves on funding research that looks at ways mint growers can either eliminate or reduce the reliance on conventional methods of pest control.
It's a cooperative venture made up from the growing community, their contributions, the mint dealers and handlers, companies like ourselves, the William Lehman Company, and then the end user community. There's 7 industrial members, there's dealers that are members, and then the growers. The growers contribute through a checkoff, a voluntary checkoff for each pound of oil they sell.
This stuff takes time and money and energy, and it all comes from the people in the mint industry. no one from the government steps up and says, we're going to help you guys produce a better mint product. It's done, it's an internal type system, and I think that, the people that are involved in it, the dealers and the farmers and some of the big end users should be commended, because it's a team effort.
Mint is grown in the United States in two areas. The Midwest, which would include the states of Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, and South Dakota, with the center of production located in the Pacific Northwest, which would include the states of Washington, which leads the world in spearmint production, Oregon, which leads the world in peppermint production, Idaho, and to some extent Montana.
So very quickly you have an example of the mint industry being associated not only with Anglo-Saxon English name families, but with a parallel migration, basically along the parallel of southern Lake Erie.
The mint industry has had its ups and downs, and we've been going through quite a few years of a down period. And every time there's a down period, there are a few more farmers that drop out, and it's just that business cycle that happens, and especially in agriculture, where the smaller farmer just keeps losing ground, and when there's a down cycle, another small farmer here and another small farmer there has to go out of business.
The cost of materials, the cost of seed, fertilizer, and so on, equipment is so outrageous today. And the small farmer buys in small quantities and he pays the top dollar. The big farmer buys in large quantities and he gets a break. And the profit in an acre is really not that great, so you have to have volume or you're not going to survive. The small farms in this country are going in droves. In fact, there's practically no such thing as a small farm left anymore. And it's really quite concerning to me. So the small farms are a thing of pretty much a thing of the past, and you'll never see that again.